Luis Ortega's pulse pounded his ears as the distant sound of helicopters grew closer, their rotor blades slicing through the thick desert air like a warning. He and his team stood frozen for a second, staring at the sealed black containers inside the cartel plane's cargo hold. The heat of the sun suddenly felt suffocating, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them like an invisible force. "This isn't just some forgotten drug run," Miguel whispered, his voice tight with fear. "This is something else." Luis knew he was right. The symbols on the containers weren't cartel markings, nor were they standard military insignias. They were deep cover intelligence codes, the kind used by Black Ops divisions that didn't officially exist. These were the kind of symbols that, if you saw them, you weren't supposed to live long enough to tell anyone. The implications crashed over Luis like a tidal wave. The Valdez cartel was wiped out 10 years ago, or at least, that's what everyone had believed. The DEA and Mexican authorities had dismantled its network, arrested its key members, and seized billions in assets. So why was a cartel plane belonging to a long-dead syndicate sitting untouched in the desert, filled with what looked like classified intelligence materials? "We need to go," he said sharply, slamming the cargo hold shut. "Now." The rest of the team hesitated. They had uncovered something no one was meant to see, something people would kill to keep hidden. Luis didn't have time to explain the depth of the danger. He just knew that whoever was coming wasn't planning to let them leave alive. Then they heard it, not just the helicopters, but the distant growl of engines, multiple off-road vehicles speeding toward them from the south. Dust clouds rose behind them, the sun reflecting off their windshields. Luis squinted, his stomach twisting into knots. "They're coming from the cartel corridor," Miguel muttered, gripping his rifle. Luis cursed under his breath. Whoever these people were, they weren't just military, and they weren't just cartel. This was something in between. He turned to the others. "Grab whatever you can carry. We're leaving. Now!" The escape begins. The men moved fast, snatching up 2 of the black containers, the only one small enough to carry, before sprinting back toward their off-road trucks parked a mile away. The sun was merciless, the sand beneath their feet loose and treacherous, but adrenaline kept them moving. Then the first gunshot rang out. A bullet kicked up a cloud of dust inches from Luis's feet. He threw himself behind a cluster of rocks as another shot whizzed past his head, its high-pitched whine slicing through the air. "Go, go, go," he shouted. Miguel and the others dove into their trucks, the engines roaring to life. Luis slid into the driver's seat of his modified Jeep, gripping the wheel as he slammed the gas. The vehicle lurched forward, its tires spinning for a moment before catching traction. Behind them, 4 black SUVs and a convoy of motorcycles surged over dunes, their masked riders armed to teeth. The pursuit was on. The Jeep tore through the desert, kicking up clouds of dust as Luis steered through the treacherous terrain. The men in the SUVs behind them were well-trained, maintaining a tight formation as they fired relentlessly at the escaping trucks. Bullets shattered the rear windshield of Miguel's vehicle, and a second later, the driver jerked violently to the side, blood spraying against the dashboard. "Down! Get down!" Miguel bellowed as he grabbed the wheel and yanked the truck back onto the path. Luis gritted his teeth. They were too exposed. The only chance they had was to outmaneuver their pursuers, and fast. The canyon trap. Luis knew the desert like the back of his hand. He had patrolled these landscapes for years and had memorized every ridge, every dry riverbed, every natural choke point. If he could just lead them into the right terrain, they might have a chance. "Follow me," he barked into the radio. He veered left, leading the convoy into a narrow canyon, a maze of jagged rocks and steep cliffs. The walls closed in, forcing the SUVs behind them into single-file formation. That's when Luis saw his opportunity. He slammed the brakes. Miguel, recognizing plan, did the same, their vehicle skidding to a halt just as the first cartel SUV came barreling through the narrow pass. Boom! Miguel and another teammate opened fire with their assault rifles, their bullets ripping through the engine block. The SUV exploded in flames, sending a shockwave through the canyon. The sudden roadblock trapped the remaining vehicles, forcing them to slam on their brakes. A few motorcycles skidded out of control, their riders tumbling into the dust. Luis didn't hesitate. "Move!" he yelled, slamming the Jeep into gear. His team sped away through the canyon's northern pass, leaving behind the wreckage, the fire, and the chaos. The unseen enemy. For a moment, silence settled over them. Only the sound of their roaring engines filled the air as they put as much distance as possible between themselves and the cartel ambush. Luis's hands were shaking against the wheel. That was too well planned. That wasn't just a random cartel patrol. They had known exactly where to go and exactly when to intercept them. That meant someone else was pulling the strings. Where do we go now? Miguel panted over the radio. Luis exhaled. We head north, across the border. There was only one place safe enough to hide something this big. What was inside the containers? Hours later, under the cover of darkness, they reached a hidden safe house in the Arizona desert. A place Luis had used during his old Border Patrol days. Inside the dimly lit bunker, they finally had a moment to breathe. Miguel set the 2 black containers on the table, eyeing them warily. We need to see what's inside. Luis nodded. He grabbed a crowbar and pried open the first case. What he saw made his blood run cold. Inside was not money, not drugs, but intelligence dossiers. Stacks of them. Files marked top secret, bearing the insignia of multiple intelligence agencies. Some American, some Mexican, some Russian. There were names, government officials, cartel leaders, CEOs of major corporations, and covert operatives embedded within law enforcement agencies around the world. Luis's stomach churned. This is not just a cartel operation. Miguel picked up a sealed manila folder, labeled Project Nocturna. Luis's hands shook as he opened it. His eyes widened in horror. It wasn't just information. It was evidence of an international conspiracy, one that went far beyond the Valdez cartel. Someone had been using cartels as pawns, trafficking not just drugs, but weapons, technology, and intelligence secrets. The Valdez cartel hadn't been wiped out. They had been absorbed into something much bigger. And now Luis and his team had the proof. But that meant one thing. They were now the most wanted men in the world. As Luis stared at the documents, he heard a sound that made his heart stop. A single drone hovering outside the window. They had been found. The low hum of the drone outside the window sent a jolt of panic through Luis Ortega's body. His instincts, honed from years of patrolling cartel corridors and dealing with organized crime, told him one thing. They weren't alone anymore. Miguel's breath hitched as he reached for his rifle. We need to move. Now. Luis gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm. They had uncovered conspiracies so massive, so well hidden, that it had remained buried for years, sealed away in a cartel plane forgotten in the desert. But now, they were holding evidence that could burn empires to the ground. He turned to the rest of the team. Pack everything. We need to get this out before they erase us. They scrambled into action, stuffing files, hard drives, and encrypted documents into backpacks. Miguel shut the case labeled Project Nocturna, his hands trembling as he secured the latches. But before they could take a single step toward the exit, a single gunshot rang out. The light bulb above them exploded, showering the room in glass. Then came the thunder of boots against desert gravel. Luis didn't hesitate. Get to the truck, Gio. The escape turns deadly. The first bullet whizzed past Luis's ear as he kicked open the bunker's back door, leading them into barren stretch of desert behind the safe house. Floodlights blazed alive in the distance, cutting through the darkness like white-hot blades. Miguel cursed. They're already here. Luis knew who it was. Not just cartel enforcers. Not just corrupt Mexican federals. This was something bigger. Something that operated above borders, above governments. These men were clean-cut military grade, wearing no identifiable insignia, their movements tight and disciplined. Private contractors. The kind used for jobs that didn't exist on paper. Luis slid behind a rusted-out truck for cover, pulling Miguel down beside him. Their other teammates scattered, returning fire in bursts. The desert night erupted in chaos, the air thick with gunpowder and the smell of burning sand. But Luis wasn't focused on the gunfight. He was focused on getting those files out, because if they didn't make it, The world would never know what was hidden inside Project Nocturna. Through the chaos, he spotted an opening, a gap in the encroaching forces near the ridge where their escape vehicle was parked. He locked eyes with Miguel. "Cover me." Miguel nodded, unleashing a hail of suppressive fire as Luis sprinted toward the truck. Bullets tore through the air inches from his body, but he didn't stop. He flung open the truck's door, tossing the stolen files into the passenger seat. Then, just as he turned to call for the others, pain exploded in his shoulder. Luis staggered, his vision blurring as a bullet ripped through flesh, sending shock waves through his body. He hit the ground hard, gasping for air as warm blood soaked his shirt. Miguel's scream barely reached his ears. "Luis!" But Luis barely had time to react before a boot pressed down on his chest, pinning him to the ground. A shadow loomed over him, one of the attackers. But not just any attacker. Luis's breath hitched in shock. It was Colonel James Mercer, a betrayal that rewrites everything. Mercer, the same U.S. military intelligence officer who had spearheaded the official dismantling of the Valdez cartel 10 years ago. The same man who had stood in front of global media cameras, shaking hands with government officials, declaring that the cartel's operations had been wiped off the map. And yet here he was, alive, armed, standing over Luis like a ghost in the past, dressed in desert fatigues with no insignia, his eyes cold and calculating. Luis coughed, spitting out sand and blood. "You're supposed to be dead." Mercer smirked. "A lot of people are supposed to be dead." Behind him, the other private military contractors tightened their formation, their weapons still trained on Luis's team. Miguel was still fighting, pinned behind the remnants of the safe house. But Mercer wasn't concerned about the gunfight. He was concerned about what Luis had found. He knelt beside Luis, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Tell me, did you look inside the files?" Luis's silence was enough of an answer. Mercer chuckled softly. "Then you know now, don't you?" Luis's jaw clenched. Project Nocturna wasn't just a cartel operation. It was a global intelligence operation. The Valdez cartel hadn't been wiped out. They had been repurposed. Their routes, their trafficking networks, their coded smuggling operations, they had all been absorbed into a larger machine, run not just by cartels, but by governments, intelligence agencies, and private corporations. Drugs, weapons, people, secrets, all moved through the same corridors. The same corridors Mercer had controlled all along. Luis's stomach twisted with rage. "You orchestrated all of it." Mercer smiled. "And for a decade, no one knew." Luis's vision swam from blood loss, but he forced himself to remain conscious. "You killed thousands, had entire families slaughtered. And for what? So you could run your own private empire?" Mercer's expression hardened. "It's not about power, Luis. It's about control." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "The world isn't run by governments. It's run by those who control the flow of chaos. And for the past 10 years, I've been keeping the world in balance." Luis felt sick. Every war, every so-called dismantled cartel, every victory against organized crime. It had all been a carefully managed illusion. And the moment Luis and his team dug up that plane, they had stepped into something bigger than they could ever comprehend. Mercer sighed. "Here's how this ends. You and your team, you disappear. The files, we take them. And the world keeps moving forward, just like it always has." Luis gritted his teeth. He had seen evil before, but nothing like this. Nothing this cold. Nothing this calculated. Then, just as Mercer raised his hand to give the order, a single gunshot rang out. Mercer stiffened, his face contorting in shock as a red mist burst from his temple. He collapsed to the sand, dead before his body even hit the ground. Standing behind him, gripping a still-smoking rifle, was Miguel. Luis gasped for breath. "You crazy son of a—" "No time," Miguel panted. "We got a GO." The final escape. With Mercer dead, his men hesitated, just long enough for Luis and Miguel to make their move. They piled into the truck, slamming the gas pedal down as bullets tore through the desert. They escaped, bleeding, bruised, but alive, and with them, The truth. The world would finally see what had been happening behind the scenes for decades. Project Nocturna was no longer a secret, and Luis Ortega would make sure everyone knew it. The aftermath, the leak that changed everything. Days later, the files were leaked to global media. Governments were shaken to their core. Intelligence agencies scrambled to discredit the evidence. But the truth was out, and for the first time in history, the world saw the faces of the men who had been running it all along. The relentless sun bore down on the Sonoran Desert, its golden sands stretching endlessly toward the horizon. For years, this unforgiving wasteland had hidden secrets buried beneath its dunes. Some lost to time, others deliberately erased. But on one fateful afternoon, a group of off-road adventurers stumbled upon something no one was supposed to find. The first to spot it was Luis Ortega, an experienced tracker and former Border Patrol officer turned desert explorer. At first, it looked like just another wreckage, the remains of some forgotten crash site. But as Luis and his team of explorers got closer, their pulses quickened. The object partially buried beneath the sand wasn't just any aircraft. It was an unmarked Mexican cartel plane, its fuselage rusted and torn apart by time, yet eerily intact. The eerie silence that surrounded it made Luis pause, his instinct screaming that something wasn't right. "This isn't normal," he muttered as he ran his hand along the faded red marking on the tail, which bore the cartel's insignia, one associated with the Valdez cartel, a brutal syndicate thought to have disappeared a decade ago. The others exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had stepped into something far bigger than a simple plane crash. The aircraft was partially buried. Yet despite years in the desert, it showed no signs of looting, a detail that made Luis's gut tighten with unease. Why would traffickers abandon a plane loaded with millions in cargo? One of the men, Miguel, asked. Unless, his voice trailed off, unless there was something inside worth more than money. With shaking hands, Luis and his team pried open the rusted cargo hatch, expecting to find long-expired bricks of narcotics or worse, the remains of smugglers who had met a grisly fate. But what greeted them inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. Stacked in careful precision were sealed black containers, military grade, marked with insignias that didn't belong to any cartel. Luis recognized the symbols immediately. They were used by clandestine intelligence operations. His heart pounded as he opened the first container, only to reel back in shock. Inside were hard drives, encrypted documents, and coded dossiers, evidence of something massive, something world-shaking. But before the weight of their discovery could sink in, a distant noise sent chills down their spines, the unmistakable sound of approaching helicopters. Someone else knew about this wreck, and they were coming to ensure that whatever secret lay buried within never saw the light of day.